They may be called the next generation, but they're the church of today. Reach, disciple, and mobilize students to share the hope of the gospel. This is the GenSend podcast with Shane Pruitt, Paul Worcester, and Lacey Villasenor.
All right, welcome friends to another conversation on the GenSend podcast. It's been an incredible fall season already. We've had some amazing conversations, have some more amazing conversations on the way, and I'm uber pumped about this conversation today. Paul, Lacey, my friends who are always here. What's up, y'all? How's it going?
Hello. We're excited to be here. I'm excited for our guest today.
Yes, it's been kind of crazy, Paul, my Instagram, because I follow so many college ministries, my Instagram is just blowing up with all the different creative events. One of them that struck my interest was the Sasquatch.
Yes, I saw you post about this.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what that means, but one of the ministries was giving away like a $300 gift card. I guess they have a suit and the person's like running around campus and whoever finds the Sasquatch gets like a $300 gift card. I think that's kind of a fun idea. Sometimes college ministries, the more zany and the more kind of wild, the better, and minorly illegal, like if it's like almost illegal, don't quote me on that one. But so I wanted to introduce our guest, Keith Wieser, and he's been doing collegiate ministry for many years. And actually 17 years ago, he planted Resonate Church up in Washington. And since then it's multiplied to 20 churches and even in multiple nations. And they have about 20,000 students that have been involved in the churches and hundreds of students coming to Christ. And then even more exciting than that, leaders raised up and sent out on mission for God's glory. So it's just this incredible story of God birthing a movement for his glory in some of the most difficult campuses. If we listed off the campuses, it's some very hard to reach campuses. And so it's exciting to have Keith on here. He's kind of in the trenches. He's picking up things that the rest of the nation needs to learn, and they're kind of running into the walls before some of us do. So actually, that's the topic of this podcast, is innovation in reaching the next generation. And so Keith is a father, a husband. He's also the author of an ebook, co-authored an ebook with Troy Nesbitt on collegiate-focused church planning that we just published at NAM. And so you can check that out in the show notes. He's also a church planning catalyst in his area, and he loves to ride ridiculously long distances on his bike as well. So anything I miss on your bio there, Keith?
Yeah, that's pretty good. That sounds way better when you say it.
Yeah. Hey, and I want to know how long are these distances we're talking about here?
Well, one of my favorites is going from Seattle to Portland. So that's about 205 miles. So it's a 2-day trip. And it's a big thing. About 10,000 people do it. So it's not that I'm unique, but just love punishment. So it's really fun.
It's the type amazing. 2 fun where it's like terrible in the moment. And then afterwards you're like, that was great.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Hey, and Keith, being a West Coast guy, are you a surfer at all? Because as you see, Paul always likes to flex his surfboard. So friends, if you're only listening to the audio, we have the video version at our YouTube channel, GenSend, and Paul always flexes his surfboards in the background there. So Keith, are you a surfer at all?
I live like 300 miles away from the ocean out here in Eastern Washington. So my surfing days were actually in high school when I lived near Houston. And if you've ever been to the Gulf of Mexico, it is terrible. So, we would there'd be a hurricane that would come, and we were like, "Yeah, let's go catch some waves." Before we have to evacuate.
Galveston's not really known as a surfing hub.
That's right.
That's right. Actually, that area is famous for tanker surfing, where these big tankers go by, and guys get boats and they surf the wakes of the giant tankers. Look it up. It's pretty interesting.
Nice.
Shane's just from small town Texas, so he only knows like surfing on like a bed of a truck,
Yeah.
riding through the fields.
Yeah. I know. Listen, I am the master of the wave pool at Great Wolf Lodge. Okay.
That is hilarious. Well, I'm really excited to get into today's topic. And yeah, I think Paul gave you a great intro. I hope you guys are excited for this conversation. It's no surprise. We've lived through some major shifts in the last 20 years, whether it's technology or social media or just everything else that has contributed to this really unique cultural moment that we're in. And I mean, I've even heard people say, like, if you haven't been a student in the last 3 years, you have no idea what it's like to be a student. It's rapidly shifting. It has shifted and it's continuing to shift. And so we really want to talk about how this has impacted discipleship and evangelism for reaching the next generation. And so, Keith, let's just start here. What are some of the major shifts you've seen in students recently?
Yeah, that's really great. I think you're right on. We're in a place of massive, massive shift. And as we're looking at things, there's things that have been happening and now they're kind of exploding. There's new things, but I think just us being able to take and clarify that is really helpful. So here's 7 things that we've discovered. This is somewhat anecdotal, combined with stuff that we're seeing in real time, plus some data, and so kind of put together. So this is just again what we're seeing. The first one is that emotion is playing a greater role in students' conscious lives. So there's just more of a sense of the emotional lives of students being more present in their decision making, in the way that they're processing the world. And, when we have put a higher emphasis as a culture on empathy, it really allows, hey, whatever you feel is your truth. And so the connection to what I feel is just more present. And that could be good, that could be bad. I'm not going to say that, but what I've realized is that in the past, if you were an emotionally intelligent minister, man, that was a perk. But you could probably do some stuff and have that not as like a significant strength of yours. Now, it's just almost in a necessity kind of a thing, because there's so much going on, and students expect any kind of person around them to recognize, to adapt, and to take into account those emotions that are so much so present. And so when they're in their decision making, there's just so much more of that is in the front of their mind, not just in the back of their mind. So it's just closer to the surface. And that leads to the second thing, and that's that anxiety is the greatest felt need of this generation. So you might have had other things. When we think about felt needs, those are those things that are present enough to be able to ask for solutions, and present enough for them to be able to say, hey, I need this to be solved. And here's what the interesting thing is, like, this anxiety and worry is more pervasive than it has been in any other time in history. And yet this identification of worry and mental health and anxiety is really something that's almost creating an identifier. And part of it is they have so many of their peers that identify as well, that essentially to be in a place where I have anxiety or I have mental health issues, it's fascinating because it becomes this thing that almost is a group bonding thing, which decreases their desire to be transformed out of it. And so there's a great need for it, but a low desire for transformation. And so anxiety is so pervasive that it tends to normalize and create group belonging. And so there ends up being kind of a pit that people get stuck in and say, hey, I don't know if I really want to do the work to process this out. I'm sitting here in a place where I'm suffering, and yet in that suffering, I'm finding this connection. Yeah. So it's an interesting moment to be able to see this. Part of this leads to number 3, is that you're seeing a protected generation, a generation that has an increased fragility. So this idea of, we talk about this discipleship tension of invitation and challenge. So you're inviting them in relationships, and yet you're challenging them towards transformation. And that piece of that transformation piece has gotten more nuanced and more challenging for students to be able, for ministers, for leaders to be able to say, how far can I challenge this person. And the balancing of all the things around them, there's just a greater sense of fragility. And also connected to that is a sense of risk aversion. And so as I've gone through like 17 years of Resonate Church, I've seen this sense of I'm going to go out and I'm going to do something. I'm going to take a risk. I've seen that threshold of desire for that and go down lower and lower. And so when we think about sending students out, mobilizing students, it used to be that sometimes parents were the greatest barrier, and now students themselves have a sense of like, I'm not sure if I want to take those kind of risks. And so that's one of the challenges that we see. Another one, number 4, is the fear of better options. So they've had so many options available to them, so many things, and this is part of what increases the anxiety. Your choices are almost unlimited. And your exposure to who you should be, what your life should look like. They see in social media the pinnacle of what a life should look like. And so it results in really some low commitment. So I think almost every college minister I've talked to is like, man, the challenge is getting people to be in a committed thing. Like, are you coming to this event? Do you want to be a part of this leadership thing? Like, so there's a sense of just we have to recognize and recalibrate to that lower level of commitment. Number 5 would be we see a sense of social regression. And I'll say it in 2 ways. There's a social regression that just comes with the ability of someone to interact with other people, to be able to form solid relationships, and specifically in doing that in person. And so we've just seen, as I've talked to people, it feels like what we've seen in college is what we used to see in juniors, seniors, in high school. Right. And so there's just a sense of a social regression, and really we're having to teach people, hey, here's how you develop friendships. Here's how you solve conflict. So these are some of the skills that are challenging for the next generation. And we're seeing those in increasing ways. And so one of the things we see is like this idea, the world of portable community through their devices. So they bring their community to college, right, in the form of their devices. And so community, that portable community versus present community and physical proximity. And so sometimes there's even I don't even want to be in these present physical domains because I have this device and I'm connected to all these people. And so so we're having to navigate how do you get into that world, and how do you help them to be able to be present in physical proximity. Number 6 would be that we're seeing there's such an identity vacuum in this generation that they're looking for those connections to who am I? And we're finding those connections to be found more in their behavior than ever before. Hey, this is what I do, and so this is who I am. So this is when that behavior is connected to an identity, it becomes really hard to eject that in terms of if it's unhealthy or if it's sinful, because as we all know, man, when we're speaking to people who have tied this to an identity, that feels like a taboo. You can't talk about me and my identity. And so separating what we used to be able to say, hey, this is what you do, this is not who you are. And so you can change that. We can name that a sin. We can help you to be able to live a healthy, thriving life because we can identify this dysfunctional behavior. But when that dysfunctional behavior is tied to some sort of an identity, man, that gets really tricky. So we're having to have identity conversations much earlier. Absolutely. And especially when it comes to gender and sexual choices, like that is one of those things that we're just having to get into those kind of identity replacement from cultural idols to identity in Christ just much faster. And there's some cool things about that, but we're having to have those at a much earlier moment in the discipleship process. Number 7, here's the last one. I think this is pretty exciting. Non-believers have more clarity related to their spiritual interest. So what we're discovering is that, there is a pretty significant clarity that people have. Either I'm interested in spiritual things or I'm not. And so it used to be you kind of had to figure out how to convince and how to bring someone into this understanding of having to shift their worldview, or if they had a fuzzy worldview, helping them to define that and understanding Jesus as a part of that. But now I think that there's a sense of people come in saying, I'm either interested in that or I'm not interested in that. So I know that that's an overgeneralization, but we're finding some really cool things. So just a few days ago, we're in Washington State University, and we just one afternoon, they went and did some surveys, and they surveyed 340 people. And out of that 340 people, 190 of them indicated an interest in joining a Bible study. And this is fascinating because most of these students are coming over to Washington State University from Seattle, which was named just one of the top 2 most unreached cities in the United States. So these are not people with Christian backgrounds, with people that have been to church, and yet you have this massive amount that are saying, "Hey, I would like to know what it's like to be in a Bible study." And so we're really seeing this really cool moment where as we're looking to say, hey, how do we interact with students on campus, being able to say, hey, we just need to start saying, are you interested in Jesus? And this idea of trying to convince people is really shifting how we're engaging lostness on our campus. So that's 7 things that we've seen. And we're kind of walking through, what does that mean for us as we begin to interact with leaders and strategies?
It's great. Yeah. And I love how you kind of ended on a high note there. It's like a lot of those were kind of realities that we need to face. And there are, but I also know that Keith is sharing from a context of have been working through these things, and they're finding solutions, and they're seeing God move in and through. So I would agree and amen all those things. But also just kind of a reminder to our listeners, those are realities, but some of those realities can even be turned into opportunities, I guess. Definitely some of them can be actual legit opportunities. So just kind of a general thought I had about that list there. We could go off, each of those could be their own podcast, to be honest. But any other thoughts on that, Shane?
Well, I was just sitting here thinking, like, first of all, we could just spend the whole rest of this conversation just going 1 through 7 and talk about what does that mean, what's next steps. That's remarkable, Keith. To me, I think that's the next ebook from you, Keith, is to nuance those 7 things, because totally. I think, used to, and I mean, Paul, Keith, especially you guys would know this best. And then Lacey and I, grew up in the South. But what I'm seeing is like, we used to say, what's on the coast, the West Coast or East Coast, within 10 years, it will be in like mid-America, right? Or to be in the southern part of the United States. But I feel like the internet, the globalization, the cell phone, social media has fast-tracked all that, because as you're talking about what you're seeing on the West Coast, used to it'd be like, oh, that's going to be our future here in the South before long. And you're describing students and young adults right here in Texas too. Like I see it even in our kids, my own kids, navigating those very things and seeing it in their friends. There was a couple that just really like stood out to me. And Keith, I love your number 2, where you were talking about how sometimes we form a group and we belong to this group and we make this our community, and we almost build our community around our struggle, or we build our community around a way that maybe we were victimized. And I think we've been sitting on that one for a while, especially because, we even made this cliche that almost became like a core value, not just in culture, but also in ministry. That cliche of it's okay to not be okay. And we were using that. And I think for so long, we were like transparency. And we wanted transparency, and we wanted authenticity, and we wanted to create groups about that. And so we got really good at transparency, but we didn't get good at transformation. So you would find like brothers and sisters, especially in college and young adult age, where they were confessing the same struggle and the same sin week after week, month after month, year after year. Praise God for the transparency, but we was never getting to transformation. And so I think that's just a good reminder. Yeah, it's okay to not be okay, but it ain't okay to stay that way when there's another way and Jesus is the way. And so I love that kind of transparency moving towards transformation. The other thing that stood out, and you definitely seeing this, I think even in Gen Alpha as they're coming up is, you remember Charlie Brown, Linus had that blanket he carried with him, and then we kind of termed that blanket a security blanket. And we all had those things as kids. It's like, I really see like screens have become the security blanket for a whole generation. And like you were saying, Keith, like I even, again, I'll see that in my own kids where I can think of my 13-year-old. She can be on her phone on FaceTime and talk to her friends for like hours. But if she sees that same friend that same day out in the wild, that's what we call it, out in the wild, and it's unplanned, they run into each other at Walmart. Like, it's so awkward. It's so incredibly awkward. It's like they're strangers. And I'm like, you were just on screen time with them, but it's so awkward in person. So we definitely have to navigate that. And then the third thing is, Keith, what you're saying about how like what you're feeling or what your desire is, or even your thoughts now become your identity or your action. So if you, for a lack of a better term, if you go after someone's actions, they think you're attacking them. And I think that's where we even get those terms of like, oh, well, you're saying what I'm doing is sinful, therefore you hate me, or you're fearful of me. You have a phobia now. And man, I just think you're spot on. And what you're seeing on the West Coast, I would say we're seeing across the nation, man. I think you're spot on with your assessment for sure.
Yeah, even in some of that stuff that you're talking about, man, as we've seen people kind of engage in some of that, it leads to that when you don't have that transformation, if you kind of go forward on that, you see that deconstruction start happening.
Yeah.
So like I look back and does this work? So that pragmatism of staying in an accepting community, but not a transformative community, ultimately you bump up into something you don't want to change, like a value system, and then you deconstruct the whole thing. And that's really, if we don't help being able to say, hey, this is something you can be released from, and this is the power of Christ in you, then we're really not offering a whole lot. And so that's a pretty critical thing for us to be able to help being able to say, hey, you can be free from this. You should be free from this. There's a vision for you to be free from this, and to be able to offer that process of saying, hey, we want to walk through this with you.
Yeah, I love it. I even as you're talking about that, Keith, I'm reminded of our friend Jonathan Pokluda, JP. We did a webinar with him, and we were kind of talking about navigating cultural issues. And he says that all the time that people come to Harris Creek and they'll go, hey, here's who we are. This is how we live. This is our identity. If we come here, do you expect us to change? And I love his response. He goes, we expect everyone to change, no matter what your background is, no matter what your navigating is, no matter what you feel your struggle is, we expect everyone to change because this is a transformational community. And I love that response. I love that answer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you wish you had your notepad out taking notes on all these points, don't worry. We're going to include a PDF in the show notes of this episode that outlines some of these changes and even some of the other stuff we're going to get into. But Keith, you mentioned a lot of good stuff. I know you have some strategies you've mentioned about how to address these changes and these shifts in students. What are some of the strategies, and what have you seen work in your context?
Yeah. First of all, we're still trying to figure out all of this, and we're saying, let's try some stuff. Let's figure it out. Let's continue to innovate. Let's figure out. Let's don't be afraid to fail. And that's what I want to say. This is to this audience, man. You have this opportunity to forge the innovation that will shape the church to come. And so these aren't definitive and directive, but these are just some of the things that we've just trying to figure out, and they might change next week. But here's where we're at. One is, I think that it's more important to be relational than ever before. So just that, I know that that's a broad statement, but we're really trying to shift into a place where we're not event driven, not vehicle driven. And by vehicle, I mean, we have small groups for disciple making, for all kinds of these things. And those are great, but those are vehicles. I think transformation happens in the context of relationship. And I think it's easy sometimes for our leaders to say, I'm a blank leader, and they attach their identity and their role to an event. So I'm a Bible study leader. not a disciple maker. And so we're trying to figure out how to help people to understand the core thing that will never change about their leadership, not just the moment that they're in terms of an event leader or anything like that. And so that's one of the things that I would just say, keep your people being attached to people. We have something we call a discipleship tree, where we have names, and who are the names that are attached to you, and not necessarily what the thing you're leading is, but who are the people that you are responsible for. So any connection to that people, that's where we get to that place where we're the institutional suspicion that is there, the suspicion of leaders. It just has to be relational, and so that we can not make church into this thing that can be put into a category and say, man, this is just another form of authoritarianism, or that idea of transformation carries with it the risk of this idea of, man, they just want me to X, Y, Z. So that's where it's important for us to be able to say it has to be primarily relational. So the other piece to this is just going back to something I mentioned before, is being direct and discerning spiritual interest. And man, one of the themes for our year is talking about, instead of being on the campus, we're in the harvest. And we're just going back to the, Luke 10:2, and we're just saying, hey, there are people on this campus that want to be disciples. They don't know it yet, but we need to find them. And so we're trying to figure out how to sort, not convince, and to be able to understand who's there, and to be able to say, man, if we have this many leaders, how are we all making disciples? And so that's a shift that we've made, and we've tried to figure out how to get our people just being more direct in, this is Jesus, and are you interested? And if the answer is no, that's okay for right now. And we're going to pray for you that the answer will be yes at some point, but we're here to find out those people who are interested in Jesus. And we're going to give our lives to helping them to become made in the image of Christ as we disciple them. And so those are a few things as we're talking about preaching. So there's some shifts in preaching as we're talking to people. So our network is from Montana to Seattle. And, there's kids from like Deerfoot, Montana, little conservative town. And there's kids from, where the anarchy was in Seattle, right? So there's all over the place. And as we're talking to this progressive and conservative kind of thing, what we've noticed is just when you're talking to kids from conservative backgrounds, clarity is the thing that they are most drawn to. I mean, they want someone to define what is right and wrong. They want to know what that is. When it comes to kids that don't have some sort of an authoritative truth basis to their worldview, if you start there, it doesn't go very well. And so being able to start at a place of, instead of clarity, you start at hope. And being able to say, here's something that you can put your hope in. And we'll build towards that as we begin to find our hope in Christ, who defines this in specific ways. That's that way that we've seen somewhat of a different way to take and have kids that are from conservative places and kids that are from progressive places, and be able to adapt to those specific needs of those worldviews.
So how do you discern which way you're going to go on that when you're in your own preaching? As a local ministry leader, you can kind of go hard on one or hard on the other, or do you want to, like, what do you advise or coach leaders on as they're processing that? Yeah.
So first of all, you're going to have conservative kids in progressive places, and you've got progressive kids in conservative places.
Yeah,
so you can't do something that's always the same thing. But if you get on campus, like, this is where we want everyone who's on this to be a missionary and to be a missiologist. Maybe more specifically, you're trying to figure out, as you're interacting with students, not assuming what they need, but being able to have enough interaction with them to be able to hear them articulate this. So that's why I think it's really important for leaders to actually be on the mission field, to be able to interact with people, to be able to not read a book about what people need, or even listen to us on this podcast, say what you need, but you need to be on the campus asking those things as students, and being able to know firsthand, what are they saying? And that just gives you a heart for those students as well. So I would just say, man, as you're interacting, just being able to utilize that framework to be able to say, where do you fall in some of that? Are you someone who's needing hope? Or are you someone who's needing clarity? And being able to use that to be able to determine how you're going to strategically engage them.
Yeah, and maybe even weave in a little bit of both into the mix of what you're teaching, so that you kind of are not alienating one audience or the other. But what I loved what you said about the personal aspect of ministry is our ministry structures are really tools for us to get to the real work, which is the disciple making and the personal relationships, and helping all of our leaders understand that. That's kind of like what we make sure we understand. Our student leaders or our volunteers, like, these things are good and you are doing that. We need that. But look past that to the personal touch. And one thing you even mentioned was how connected students are to their little clique, their little group. And there's just like this hyper connectivity, I guess is the word. Even I saw on the PDF there, hyper connectivity of this little friend group. And so I'm actually encouraging leaders now to start praying for whole friend groups to come to Christ. So not just pray for individuals. Yes, we want to see individuals, but when we see an individual, as we're sowing broadly and discovering people that God is already working in, I'm challenging people to look for that. And that's kind of Jesus's model, was a person of peace that can unlock a whole network of people. And sometimes starting a specific Bible study or evangelistic group just for that friend group, even if it's not a clear affinity group like a fraternity, sometimes it's just, hey, your friends. Let's start an evangelistic Bible study for your friends. And maybe you don't use that terminology, but discovery group or, something like that. And you can reach a whole network of people at the same time, actually. So that's one solution I've been seeing get traction, kind of a way to maximize this hyper connectivity. And they are relational, but they're not necessarily social in a extroverted sense. Does that make sense? So they're kind of, so that's kind of some things I've noticed.
That's really good.
Yeah. And I feel like, Lacey, if you want to speak to this, I feel like especially in college and young adult age, like girls can even be more that way than guys. It's like whatever kind of like the struggle is with one, eventually that tight group all seems to have that same struggle, or whatever that hope is or that truth is or belief is with one, then eventually that whole little group has it. And you'll see them even celebrate together, because I think of like, it's crazy, and I love it when I see it. It's beautiful, but I really see this with college and young adults more than anybody else, is like, if it's invitations given, and one of it, especially if a girl, if she gets saved, that like whole little group will like almost like dogpile her, like they're just so excited. It's just that immediate community that just immediately forms around, especially I think young adult girls. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that's true. I think it was so interesting too when you were talking about going into the harvest and, really identifying, well, who is already open, because that is a shift I've seen. My sister lived in the Northwest for a while. She's in Oregon, and she's the typical like hippie new age spirituality, and she found her group really in like Eugene, Oregon, found people just like her because she came from Texas, obviously not as much of that here, and really got in even deeper in that spirituality when she found other people who affirmed her, and she didn't have to really change much about herself. It was just a group that allowed her to belong. And for so long I wanted her to know the Lord, and I still do and still pray for that. But I had to have this shift where it's like, okay, she's not spiritually open to hearing that just yet. And so I've learned the things that I can say and the things I can't say just by asking questions or having conversations. Like, I can tell her I'm praying for her, or I can tell her what I believe, but she doesn't want me to like push those, or she doesn't want it to seem like I'm pushing those beliefs on her. And so I think that's even a really helpful shift for us to have is there is a lot because people identify so closely with what they do and how they are. It does feel like we're attacking them if they're super closed off to it, or if they are spiritually just in a, spiritually closed off, or spiritually, might be believing in a totally different belief system. And so really identifying that harvest, I think, is a huge piece of it. And it has been a shift in the last few years, because typically, you just go out and you just, share with everybody, pray for everybody. But I think there has been the, oh, you're pushing your beliefs on me, you hate me, that kind of shift. And so that's interesting. It's interesting that you're seeing that up there and that you guys have made that. Shane, we've talked a lot about the changes and shifts that we've seen, but Shane, you put an article out at the beginning of the semester about strategies that still work today. And so what are some of those like cornerstone principles that are still effective, in next gen ministry and even in all different types of contexts?
Yeah. And I've loved everything that Keith has shared and Paul has shared and you have shared, because, oh gosh, the world is changing so fast. Culture is changing so fast. And so a lot of times, I think, especially as next gen leaders, if you care about reaching teenagers and college students and young adults, that can feel so overwhelming. Lacey, I even think of a mutual friend of mine and yours who he was in student ministry for 25 years, and then he became a campus pastor for 3 years. Then he went back to student ministry, and he's like, my gosh, I feel like I'm starting over. I have no idea what these kids are talking about. Like, what's a furry? You know what I mean? So he's like navigating all of those things. He feels like he's starting over. And so I just want to say, I think sometimes we can put the pressure on us to go, I can't keep up with this. I don't know what to do, and so I think we always approach it like missionaries, and just like missionaries do, they study cultures, they study thoughts, they study worldviews, they study languages and people groups, and we must continue to do that. But I think we always anchor to the things that have been true for 2,000 years as well, to take hope to know this, that if you've been bought by the blood of Jesus, you have the Holy Spirit of God. Number one, be Spirit-led, that the Holy Spirit of God in you loves the next generation even more than you do. The Holy Spirit in you knows how to reach college students and young adults even more than you do. The Holy Spirit in you knows how to disciple teenagers even more than you do. So just be led by the Spirit. He knows what he's doing. The second thing that's been true for 2,000 years is to preach the word. Now, how we communicate, I love what Keith said. We may have to be, how we communicate and the styles and the approaches we take has to be different. And I think we have to be flexible in that. And we have to understand who we're talking to and who the audience is. But at the main thing is that you're still wanting to be text driven. You're still wanting to preach the word. I know one of the questions I get all the time, I've mentioned this before, but one of the questions I get all the time is people are wanting books. And a lot of times those are the silver bullet solutions, right? So they'll be like, hey, what's the best book out there that I can read on navigating all this sexuality talk? Or what's the best book out there I can read on gender confusion? Or what's the best book I can read on paganism or political polarization? And I always just say the Bible is really good. And the reason that Paul addresses a lot of those things in the New Testament, because if you go back, all of these things that we're seeing today were also taking place in Rome. That's why Paul addresses it. That's why Paul talks about it. And here's the church being planted and flourishing. And if you believe what we believe, a lot of those disciples were teenagers or young adults, and God's using them to turn the world upside down for his glory. So we're like, stick to the word of God. It's always relevant. If you want to be relevant, stick to the word of God, because it's not an old book, it's a living book. And then the third thing is preach the gospel. That is the hope of the world. And the same gospel that has worked for 2,000 years still works today. And I'm seeing exactly, what Keith is seeing, what Paul is seeing, Lacey, what you've shared before too, is personally, I've seen a greater interest in recent years from teenagers, college students, young adults. I've seen more college students, teenagers, young adults make professions of faith in Jesus for salvation, that openness. And I think some of it had to do with the pandemic. The pandemic didn't create new problems. It just poured gasoline on the problems of a generation in their formative years. So they know they're broken. They know the world's broken. And like he said, they're looking for hope. They're looking for answers. They're looking for truth. And that's why I think as the church, we got to stay on mission. That was the fourth thing. We can't get sidetracked like and come into these conversations with our politics or our opinions or how we were raised. We come in with the gospel of Jesus Christ and say, you're actually, yes, you're looking for hope, you're looking for answers, you're looking for truth, you're actually looking for a person. And his name is Jesus. And I think there's an interesting thing taking place too, as well. I've kind of been saying this lately and I kind of see it. And Keith, I'd be really interested to see if you see this, especially in your context, but it's almost like, college students, especially young adults, they don't trust cultural narratives right now. So, because they know like the news has a spin, social media has a spin, agendas are being placed on their generation. So it's almost like they don't trust cultural narratives. So the more, for lack of a better term, culture says, stay away from Jesus, stay away from the church, stay away from the Bible, it almost drives up curiosity because there's a little bit of rebellious streak in all of us going, oh, maybe I should check that out. Everything that, this thing that everybody's telling me to stay away from, maybe I'm kind of intrigued. Maybe I should check that out. And so you almost see that as well,
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of they've been raised in a social media world where they're savvy to the fact that they're being influenced and they're savvy to the fact that, man, they're in a place where their attention is the new commodity. And I think that they're vetting who it is that they're going to listen to. And it's not institutional normatives. It is an individual choice.
Yep. Yep.
That's good.
Completely.
That's good.
Yeah, Keith, you guys are, we've talked about this a few times, and I know on a personal level, you're in like a really difficult to reach place. And even that range, Montana to Washington and Oregon, Pacific Northwest, like that, all of that area is so unreached, so hard to reach. And you guys are continuing to plant campuses in these places. I think you guys are in London now. You can correct me if that's wrong, which is also really, really hard.
We're headed there.
Okay, headed to London, a really hard secular place to reach as well. And so very post-Christian. What are some things that are helping you guys continue to multiply in these really hard places? That's the first part. Second part of this, and what are some things churches, ministers, whoever's listening to this can do to even start reaching college students, the college campus near them? Because it might seem too daunting to them for some reason, or the challenges might seem too great. What would you say to them?
Yeah, one of the most helpful things about being in the Northwest is that the overwhelming nature of the task makes you have to rethink all the things that you've considered normative. And so we've just had to say, okay, if it's an overwhelming task, how do we get there? And one of the things that we've really seen is we've gone back to look at how the church started in Acts and saw this amazing story that these people transformed the world, the greatest social movement ever. And really that was this thing that was specific to, this idea of multiplication has captured me for the last decade. And it really goes back to reading the text, going back to the Great Commission. And you see this fascinating moment where, Jesus has died and he's been resurrected, and he gathers these guys before he leaves. And the fascinating thing is right before, they worship, and then some doubted. And I'm just like, how is it you're looking at a man who's been resurrected and some doubted? And it wasn't until he leaves, sends them out on this Great Commission where 100% of them, right? We see all of them at that point go and give their lives for the mission of God. And it's after Jesus leaves. They go from weak and doubtful to creating the most significant moment in human history. And it seems like the transformation happened after Jesus sent them out, not before. And so we just are convinced that multiplication and the idea that this is not just for the non-believer. We're not multiplying to reach the lostness only. It's the greatest maturing process that we've discovered to help people become like Christ. Amen. And if you're not sending out students to multiply, you're missing the most significant disciple-making tool that Jesus gave us. And so this is us just being able to say, man, we're trying to have a vision for gospel saturation versus a vision for participating in events. We think about filling the white spaces. We're empowering and equipping. We have a week in spring and fall where we just take and have what we call I, see, and you conversations, where we just take and essentially ensure that every student has a vision for their next step in their lives as a leader, as a follower of Jesus. And I believe that most of the time people don't take the next steps in leadership because no one directly and specifically asked them to. So in the Northwest, we're just trying to figure out with this massive task, how do we take and have clear multiplication that goes back to what we saw in the book of Acts. And so if you're wanting to do something on the college campus, just to get to the second point that you're talking about, that's what I would just say, go to the campus, talk to students, pray, and ask the Lord to break your heart for the campus. And then the number two thing is find someone who's doing it and discover the strategy so you're not replicating the things that have already been discovered. So, man, these two guys, Paul and Shane, have just done a great job in creating coaching networks and being able to provide resources. There's such a gift to the church and across, reaching the next generation across the United States and Canada. For us to be able to have tools that allow us to be able to not just go and hope, but to be able to go with tools to be able to know what to do and to be able to simply execute what God's laid upon our heart. So there's a lot of great opportunity there. And I'm just really thankful for you guys for really dedicating your lives to the next generation.
Oh,
Thanks,
man.
Keith. Man, it's so encouraging. And I have to piggyback on some of the things you're saying about multiplication. And I think actually, if you have a vision for multiplication and a culture of multiplication, that can draw students in, even the ones that are struggling with anxiety and this list of other things, into something bigger than themselves. And if they're doing that in community, then there's a good chance that many of them will step out of their shell and I haven't found anything better to help someone overcome that inward focus, that anxiety, than being a part of the movement of God on mission via evangelism, disciple making, living on mission. And actually, I teach when I encourage leaders to teach. It's okay to step into these things with anxiety, with these other kind of struggles in your life, because if we put up this perfect kind of facade, you have to be like this perfect person to get going towards mission. We're not going to have anyone. But if you're like, hey, we're all doing it, we're all in this together, then they can kind of grow out of those things as they step into that mission. So I think a strong vision for evangelism, spiritual multiplication, and even taking new territory, so to speak, of starting new churches, starting new ministries, that can be like a force that kind of draws people in, and people grow out of some of that stuff as they're in mission. So I love that, man. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, man, yeah. Thank you, Keith, for your kind words, man. You're the guru. You're one of the smartest guys I know. I'm going to now be annoying you to write an ebook on those 7 things, because that is amazing.
You heard it here
man,
first, guys.
yeah, man, you've been such a great example to the rest of us for a long time. Like, there's no one better that I know of than you of mobilizing and seeing multiplication take place, man. So I'm so thankful there's brothers out there to run that race with, like you, man. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll put that new ebook in the show notes. No, I'm just kidding. But we will include the ebook that he did already, right? We'll include that in the show notes as usual. But anything else, Keith, that you want to point people to? Maybe the Resonate Collective. Tell us, plug anything you want to plug. This is your promotional slot.
Yeah, one of the things over the last 17 years is just we've tried to multiply, and as we multiply and scale, we created opportunities to be able to support churches. And so we started churches. We started planting churches in 2014 because we felt like we didn't want to hoard resources in one church, and we felt like what God has given us, we needed to spread. And so we started planting churches in 2014. And over the last couple of years, we just thought, hey, we have these resources of helping churches to be able to manage their finances, to be able to raise support, to be able to do HR, to be able to do leadership development, to be able to run college ministry playbooks. How do we support a movement? And if God's called us to do this, this is not just about one church. It's about helping any church that wants to really be able to take the next step, and for us to be able to handle some of that back end so they can be missionaries on whatever context God has called them to do. So that's what we've discovered, and we want to be able to provide as services and resources And so we have the Resonate Collective. So resonatecollective.com, you can find out how to take your next steps on that. And so I want to close with one crazy story. We started talking about illegal stuff that people do. And it reminded me of one moment that we had where we had a small group that was in a dorm, and they were like doing stuff where they were like popping balloons. And it created this massive issue where they thought that something was illegal was going on. So they called a SWAT team. And so this small group was happening. They kicked down the doors and raided one of our small groups and found that they were popping balloons. And so anyway, crazy stuff.
Yes.
That Bible study grew by 2 or 3 times because it got such notoriety on campus. This is the
promotion. All press is good press.
That's crazy.
As you reach and disciple college students, even in high school and middle school, as culture shifts, as times change. Again, we'll include all those resources we've mentioned throughout the podcast in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next time.